his sister. But her death, which happened 10 years before his own, produced a great alteration in his home. For to supply her loss, he invited and received into his house the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, the legal inheritor of the Norland estate, and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it. In the society of his sisters. To take £3,000 from the fortune of their little dear boy would be impoverishing him to the most dreadful degree. She begged him to think again on the subject. How could he answer it to himself to rob his child, and his only child too, of so large a sum? And what possible claim could the Miss Dashwoods, who were related to him only by half-blood, which she considered as no relationship at all, assistance and kindness to them as you have described. When my mother removes them into another house, my services shall be readily given to accommodate her as far as I can. Some little presents of furniture, too, can be acceptable then. Certainly, returned Mrs. John Dashwood, but, however, one thing must be considered. When your father and mother moved to Norland, though the furniture of Stanhill was sold, all of the china, plate, and linen were saved, and is now left to your mother. Her house will therefore be almost completely fitted up as soon as she takes it. That is a material consideration, undoubtedly, a valuable legacy indeed, and yet some of the plate would have been a very pleasant addition to her own stock here. Yes, and the set of breakfast china is twice as handsome as to what belongs of this house, a great deal too handsome in my opinion for any place they can ever afford to live in. But, however so it is, your father thought only of them, and I must say this, that you owe no particular gratitude to him, nor attention to his wishes, for we very well know that if he could, he would have left almost everything in the world to them. The argument was irresistible. It gave to his intentions whatever the decision of his wanting before, and he finally resolved that would be absolutely unnecessary, if not highly indecorous,